Welcome to the Word for 2021. Today we're in Numbers chapter 20. This chapter begins with the death and burial of Miriam, and it ends with the death of Aaron. But in the middle, Moses and Aaron, they actually misrepresent God. In verse 2, there was no water for the community to drink, and so they complain. Opposition is directed towards Moses and Aaron. What do? They humble themselves before God to find out what should they do to handle this situation. In verse 8, God tells them, take the staff and then speak to that rock and water will come out. In verse 9, possibly in frustration and anger, Moses, he adds his 2 cents worth to it and he actually exalts himself. He calls the people together and he says to them, listen, you rebels, must we bring water out of this rock for you? And then Moses hits the rock twice. Water does come out of the rock. But in verse 12, God speaks to the men and he says to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not enter the promised land. It's even reiterated in verse 24. What's the reason why they won't enter the promised land? Because both of you rebelled against my command, God said. God expected them to trust him and to honor him before others. The same is true today. God marks down what we say when we speak on behalf of him. That's why James tells us in chapter 3, verse 1, not many of you, my brothers, should presume to be teachers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. Now here was the problem. For Moses and Aaron, they let pride take root, and they actually tried to take credit for God's miraculous provision. That was a sin, and God never excuses sin. Moses, he disobeyed. He was only supposed to speak to the rock, but instead he hit the rock, not once, but twice. He meant to. Again, God does not excuse sin. He was to simply obey God and speak to the rock. Water would come out of that rock. Partial disobedience, however, is still disobedience. It's sin. Here's the question for us today. Do we ever take credit for God's work? When we are able to do something and people give a compliment, what do? How do we handle it? We might think, well, I did that. But in reality, we were only able to do what we did because of God's graciousness and his gifts to us. Everything that we have, everything that we are, is because of God's goodness and his grace. All the gifts, the talents, and the abilities that we possess is because they all came from God. Therefore, we should never take credit. We should always be giving glory to God. If we don't trust God and we're not honoring him. We need to take this chapter seriously because God expects us to trust him and to honor him before others. We need to be giving glory to God. Thank you for joining the Word for 2021.